Tonight, as the world sleeps, some people are just starting their shift. They're watching, listening, protecting, but what if something is watching them back? Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and listen to what these security guards encountered when they were truly alone in the dark. Story 1, The Factory's Memory. This happened to me in the fall of 2019, when I was working nights as a security guard for the abandoned Blackwood Mill on the outskirts of Mill Creek, Ohio. It was an old textile factory, shut down since the early 90s, a hulking skeleton of brick and corrugated steel on the edge of Route 32. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., a solitary vigil over acres of silence and dust. Most nights, it was incredibly boring. I'd walk my rounds, check the old padlocks, maybe sit in my beat-up Ford Ranger for an hour, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to AM radio crackle through the static. The factory itself was a relic. Most of the valuable machinery had been stripped years ago, leaving behind cavernous rooms filled with nothing but shadows and the ghosts of forgotten industry. It smelled faintly of old oil, damp concrete, and something vaguely metallic, a scent that clung to the very air. I grew to know every creak and groan of that place. The wind whistling through broken windows sounded like distant moans, and the shifting of the old steel beams often mimicked footsteps. I'd tell myself it was just the building settling, just the cold night air playing tricks. The loneliness, though, that was the hardest part. 8 hours of almost total silence, save for my own breathing and the occasional hoot of an owl from the surrounding forest. You start talking to yourself, humming old songs, just to fill the void. My routine was solid. Clock in, make my initial rounds of the perimeter, then move inside, checking the 4 main sectors. Sector 3, the old finishing department, was the largest and most dilapidated. It had a sealed-off section, deemed unsafe, boarded up with thick planks and a faded "danger" sign. It was just a job, a way to pay the bills after my last construction gig fell through. I wasn't looking for anything exciting, just a steady paycheck. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what it was, dull, predictable, and blessedly uneventful. Then, the small things started. Nothing dramatic, just off. I'd noticed certain areas felt unusually cold, even for an unheated factory in late autumn. Pockets of absolute chill, as if someone had left a freezer door ajar in the middle of a vast hall. I attributed it to drafts, the crumbling insulation. Sometimes, I'd catch a faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, like a radio playing far away. It sounded almost like a child's voice, a soft, indistinct murmur. My mind, I told myself, playing tricks in the silence. There were other sounds too. A rhythmic tapping, like metal on metal, coming from somewhere in Sector 3. It would start and stop, never long enough for me to pinpoint. I'd walk towards it, my heavy boots echoing, only for it to cease the moment I got close. One night, I was sure I heard a faint scratching, a dry, insistent sound, coming from behind the sealed-off section of Sector 3. It reminded me of a mouse, or maybe a loose piece of plaster dragging across the floor. I shone my flashlight, but saw nothing. A few times, I'd find a door I was certain I'd closed, slightly ajar on my next round. Not wide open, just enough to catch my eye, to suggest someone had passed through. I'd always just mutter to myself about faulty latches, or my own forgetfulness. The cold spots became more frequent, and more intense. One particular stretch of walkway, leading towards the sealed-off room, became a notorious icebox, even on relatively mild nights. My breath would plume out, and my skin would prickle with goosebumps despite my heavy jacket. I started feeling watched. Not in an aggressive way, more like a persistent, curious gaze from the shadows. I'd whip my head around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, expecting to see a squatter or a curious teenager, but there was never anything. Just dust motes dancing in the light. The whispers intensified, too. They weren't just distant now. Sometimes, they felt like they were right behind me, a breathy, frantic murmur that made the hair on my arms stand up. I'd spin around, heart hammering, but again, nothing. Only the echoing silence of the factory. Then came the smell. Faint at first, a metallic tang mixed with something sweet, like old candy or dried blood. It would waft in and out, strong enough to make me pause, then vanish completely. It wasn't the usual factory smell, this was something alien, disturbing. I began to dread Sector 3. The air there always felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. The sealed room, especially, drew my eye. The planks looked older, more worn than they should, almost like they were struggling to hold something in. One night, as I passed the sealed room, I saw it. Wedged in a crack between two warped planks, a splash of faded color. I got closer, shone my light. It was a child's wooden building block, painted red, with a faded on its side. It looked ancient, almost fused with the grime. My blood ran cold. The danger sign, the sealed-off space, it was for a reason. And a child's toy. This was beyond drafts and settling beams. I tried to dismiss it, told myself some kids must have snuck in, playing a prank. I debated moving it, but something stopped me. A morbid curiosity, perhaps. Or a deeper, unacknowledged fear. I left it there, the little red block a beacon of wrongness in the gloom. The next night, I checked. The block was gone. My heart leaped. I searched the floor around the sealed room, thinking it had just fallen. Nothing. It had simply vanished. This was no prank. This was something else. I convinced myself I was imagining things. That the dark and the silence were finally getting to me. But a seed of genuine fear had been planted. I started rushing my rounds in Sector 3, spending as little time there as possible. A few shifts later, the smell returned, stronger this time. That metallic, sweet scent, right near the sealed room. It was cloying, like old blood mixed with syrup. It made me gag. And then, I saw it again. Not the block, but a small, worn rag doll, lying face down a good 20 feet from the boarded entrance to the sealed room. It was filthy, its fabric faded and torn, one button eye missing. It looked like it had been forgotten for decades. This was impossible. Absolutely, unequivocally impossible. The doll wasn't there an hour ago. And it couldn't have gotten out of that room by itself. My mind reeled. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam trembling on the pitiful toy. A voice, a little girl's voice, whispered my name from behind the boards. It was faint, distorted, but clear enough to make me stumble backward. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound meant for me. My blood ran cold. The rule. Never go into the sealed section. It was for my safety, the company said. But now, something was calling to me from inside, something that had moved a child's toy. I knew I had to see. I had to know. With trembling hands, I found a loose plank near the bottom of the sealed entrance. It took effort, but I managed to pry it back, just enough to create a gap large enough to peer through. Dust poured down, thick and suffocating. I shone my light into the darkness beyond. The air inside was impossibly colder, thick with that metallic sweet smell. It was a small storage area, filled with rusted shelving and what looked like old crates. Nothing immediately jumped out. But then, my light caught something in the back, behind a stack of broken wooden pallets. A small, dark stain on the concrete floor, almost faded to obscurity. And next to it, a child's shoe, tiny and worn, half buried under debris. Just one shoe. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a sealed-off room. This was a grave. And the toys, they were a lure. A horrifying realization started to dawn on me, chilling me to the bone. This factory wasn't just old. It held a memory. I backed away, hands shaking, heart pounding like a drum. I quickly pushed the plank back into place, forcing it as tight as I could. I didn't want to know any more. I wanted to forget what I'd seen, what I'd smelled, what I'd heard. For the rest of that shift, I stayed in my truck, watching the sunrise paint the sky an indifferent orange. I called my boss, concocting an excuse about feeling unwell, and left as soon as my replacement arrived. I didn't want to go back. But the bills wouldn't pay themselves, and I needed the money. 2 days later, I was back, my dread a cold knot in my stomach. I promised myself I'd avoid Sector 3 entirely, stick to the main halls, stay safe. That night, the factory felt different. It was alive. Not with the sounds of wind or settling, but with a palpable hum, a low vibration that thrummed through the soles of my boots. The air was thick, heavy, like static before a storm. Every cold spot was a blast of Arctic air. Every whisper was now a distinct, frantic murmur. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the numbers on my patrol sheet, but it was impossible. The factory was waking up. As I made my final round, heading towards the exit in the main assembly hall, I caught my reflection in one of the enormous grime-covered windows. It was streaked with decades of dirt, barely transparent, but I could still see myself. But it wasn't just me. My reflection was changing. The lines of my face blurred, softened. My jaw tightened, my eyes widened with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. It was my face, but younger. So much younger. A child's face. My mouth opened in a silent scream. My reflection was me, but trapped. Trapped within the glass, small, helpless, and absolutely petrified. I reached out, my hand touching the cold, dusty pane. The reflection pressed its tiny hands against the other side, mirroring my gesture, but inside the glass. A low growl started then. Deep, metallic. The ancient machinery, dormant for decades, began to stir. A distant clanking. A heavy thud. Gears grinding, slow and reluctant at first, then picking up speed. The whole building began to vibrate around me. The air in the room grew impossibly cold. My breath plumed out in thick clouds. The metallic, sweet smell was overwhelming now, choking me. The machinery roared to life. Belts slapped. Pistons hissed. 1,000 forgotten processes were restarting, all around me. My reflection was fully a child now, my small, terrified face contorted in a silent, desperate cry. I understood then. The factory wasn't just haunted. It was replaying a tragedy. And I wasn't watching it. I was becoming it. I was the child. The grinding intensified. The whirring machinery became a deafening symphony of industrial terror. I felt myself shrinking, my body growing weaker, my legs wanting to give out. The cold bit into my very bones. I was becoming small. Trapped. I stumbled. I fought it. With a desperate, animalistic cry, I tore my eyes from the window, from the terrified child that was me. I bolted. I ran through the roaring, vibrating factory, the sounds of gears and steam chasing me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until I burst through the main doors, gasping for air, collapsing on the cold concrete outside. The factory stood silent behind me, dark and still. But I knew it wasn't silent. I never went back to the Blackwood Mill. I moved out of Mill Creek that same week. But it followed me. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel pockets of impossible cold in my own apartment. I hear the faintest whirring sound, just at the edge of hearing, like distant machinery. And I avoid mirrors now, especially at night. Because sometimes, just for a flicker, I still see it. Not my reflection, but a younger, terrified version of myself, trapped and screaming soundlessly within the glass. The factory's memory lives on, and a part of me, that terrified child, is still there, caught in its grinding gears. And if you ever find yourself alone in an abandoned building, and you feel the cold, and you hear the whispers, don't look too closely in the windows. Story 2, Terminal Glitch. This happened to me in the fall of 2019, when I was working nights at a modern, automated data center in Clifton, New Jersey. My shift was the graveyard run, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, which meant my daily routine was completely inverted from the rest of the world. The facility was located just off Route 9, tucked away in a sterile industrial park surrounded by dense patches of overgrown pine trees that always seemed to whisper in the October wind. It was my first real job after college, and while the pay wasn't amazing, the absolute solitude of the night shift suited my introverted nature perfectly. The drive to work was always the same, a quiet, foggy cruise down Route 9, listening to late-night talk radio while the headlights cut through the thick Jersey mist. I would always stop at the 7-Eleven on the corner of Broad Street to grab a large, lukewarm black coffee and a stale glazed donut from the glass case. The cashier, an older guy named Frank who wore thick glasses, never said much beyond a tired nod, but that silent interaction was my last anchor to the normal world before I entered my isolation chamber for the next 8 hours. The Apex hosting facility itself was a massive, windowless concrete monolith that housed thousands of high-density servers for major cloud providers. My job was incredibly simple, almost boring to a fault: walk the perimeter once every 3 hours, monitor the massive industrial climate control systems, and watch the security feeds. For the most part, I was completely alone in a building that felt like a giant, humming tomb of glass and steel, with only the white noise of cooling fans to keep me company. Inside the security control room, I had a bank of 12 high-definition monitors displaying various angles of the server floors, the loading docks, and the exterior perimeter. The air inside the office was always kept at a biting 68 degrees to prevent the sensitive electronics from overheating, smelling faintly of static electricity, ozone, and carpet cleaner. It was a sterile, predictable world where nothing ever changed, which is why I actually grew to enjoy the absolute quiet of the nights, using the long hours to read or study. That comfort began to unravel during the second week of October, right as the autumn chill was starting to turn into a deep, biting freeze. I was sitting at my desk around 2 a.m., nursing my cold coffee, when a soft amber alert began flashing on the auxiliary network diagnostic monitor. It was a ping response, a simple heartbeat signal, originating from Sector 4, Server Bank D, Rack 12. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing as a sudden wave of confusion washed over me. Sector 4 was a decommissioned wing of the facility that had been completely powered down and stripped of its fiber optic connections 3 months prior. It was a dead zone, a dark hallway of empty metal cabinets that shouldn't have had any electricity flowing through them, let alone network activity. I figured it was just a lingering routing table glitch in the diagnostic software, a ghost IP address still floating around in the system's automated memory. I cleared the alert, logged it as a minor software anomaly, and went back to my book. But the next night, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the amber alert returned with a persistent, soft chiming sound that made me startle in my chair. This time, it wasn't just a single isolated ping, it was a continuous stream of outbound data packets, attempting to establish a secure handshake with the primary gateway. I pulled up the system log and watched the lines of code scroll by, my fingers tracing the screen as I tried to make sense of the incoming data. The packet sizes were identical, repeating a highly structured, algorithmic sequence. I decided to pull up the closed-circuit camera feed for Sector 4, ILD, hoping to see if a technician had left a diagnostic tool plugged in. The camera was an older analog-over-IP unit that struggled in the low-light environment of the decommissioned wing, showing a grainy, monochrome view of the silent aisles. As I watched the screen, the video feed began to stutter violently, the digital compression artifacts swirling and clumping together in a way that didn't look like normal static. Instead of the typical horizontal scan lines, the digital noise on the monitor started to organize itself into blocky, geometric clusters. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging the screen slightly, as the shifting pixels began to outline a human silhouette standing in the center of the aisle. It was a tall, unnaturally thin shape that didn't match any of the server rack structures, and for a split second, the blocky head seemed to tilt sideways, looking directly into the camera lens before the entire feed cut to black. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs while a sudden, deep chill swept through the small security office. I rubbed my eyes hard, telling myself that it was just a trick of the low-resolution sensor and my own sleep-deprived imagination. But then, the temperature sensor for Sector 4 suddenly spiked on my console, plummeting from 68 degrees down to a freezing 35 degrees in a matter of seconds. Then, a faint, wet tapping sound came through the open audio feed of that empty, dark corridor. The sound was rhythmic and metallic, like someone slowly tapping a fingernail against the glass door of a server rack. Protocol strictly dictated that I was never to enter a decommissioned sector alone at night, and I was supposed to call the regional duty manager for any physical anomalies. But I knew how stupid I would sound trying to explain a ghost in the server racks, and I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a faulty AC unit or a loose panel. I grabbed my heavy mag-light flashlight and my security keycard, stepping out into the cold corridor. The walk to Sector 4 felt incredibly long that night, my heavy boots echoing loudly against the polished concrete floor like a slow heartbeat. The familiar, comforting hum of the active servers in the other wings began to fade, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. When I reached the heavy, fire-rated security door of Sector 4, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keycard scanner as a deep, instinctual warning screamed at me to turn around and walk away. I swiped the card anyway, and the heavy electromagnetic lock released with a loud, metallic clack that echoed down the empty hallway. I pushed the door open, stepping into a wall of freezing air that smelled strongly of static, ozone, and a bizarre, distinct scent of wet, damp earth. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the bright beam of my flashlight as I slowly swept it down the long, empty aisle of Server Bank D. The decommissioned racks stood like towering steel tombstones on either side of me. As I neared Rack 12, I noticed a pale, sickly yellow glow pulsing slowly from the built-in diagnostic screen at the base of the tower. It was impossible, the power cables had been physically severed weeks ago, yet the screen was alive, displaying a chaotic stream of corrupt code that scrolled upward at a blinding speed. I pulled out my company-issued tablet to scan the physical asset barcode on the side of the rack, hoping to force a manual system status check and find a logical explanation. The moment the tablet's camera lens aligned with the barcode, the screen glitched violently, the display flickering between a lime-green static and the camera feed. I looked down at the screen, and my blood ran completely cold as my hand began to shake uncontrollably. On the display, I could see myself standing in the dark aisle, but right behind my shoulder, standing in the shadows, was a tall, fragmented figure made of shifting, pixelated digital noise. Its face was a chaotic vortex of static, but I could clearly make out two dark, hollow pits where its eyes should have been. I spun around with a gasp, swinging my flashlight into the empty space behind me, the beam cutting through the freezing air. There was nothing there. Only the cold, dark aisle and the steady, rhythmic pulsing of the yellow light from the dead server rack. But the smell of damp earth grew suddenly overpowering, and I heard a faint, wet wheezing sound coming from inside the ventilation duct directly above my head, like someone struggling to breathe through water. Panic seized me, completely stripping away my professional duty. I turned and bolted down the aisle, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the dark metal walls as my feet scrambled for traction on the slick concrete floor. I threw my entire weight against the heavy exit door, spilling out into the main corridor and running as fast as my legs could carry me back to the security office. I slammed the heavy office door shut, locking the deadbolts and collapsing into my rolling chair, gasping for breath as my mind raced to process the impossible horror I had just witnessed. I looked up at the wall of security monitors, hoping to see the quiet, empty halls of the facility, but what I saw made me freeze in absolute terror. All 16 screens were flickering in perfect unison, displaying the same highly distorted, high-contrast image. It was a face, but it was horribly malformed, its digital features stretched and pulled by video compression like a melting wax figure in a furnace. The mouth was stretched open impossibly wide, locked in a silent, agonizing scream that seemed to vibrate through the glass. Before I could even scream, a loud, sharp alert tone chimed from my main administration terminal, a sound so loud it made my ears ring. The main monitor went pitch black, and a simple command prompt window opened in the center of the display, the cursor blinking steadily. I watched, paralyzed with dread, as a single line of bright green text typed itself out, letter by letter, "You are the new data." A heavy, ominous click echoed from the door frame as the office's electronic fire doors sealed shut. The massive magnetic locks engaged with a finality that made my stomach drop, and instantly, the overhead lights flickered once and died. The room was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the sickly, radioactive green glow of the terminal screen shining on my terrified face. I threw myself against the locked door, clawing desperately at the manual release override, but the heavy metal handle was freezing cold, burning my palms with an unnatural, icy frost that made me scream in pain. Behind me, the cooling fans in the wall server rack began to whir, spinning faster and faster until they sounded like a wet, desperate gasp for air. With a strength born of pure, primal survival instinct, I grabbed the heavy metal fire extinguisher from its bracket and slammed it repeatedly against the office's narrow observation window. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed, and on the third strike, it shattered outward, allowing me to scramble through the jagged frame, tearing my clothes and slicing my skin in the process. I didn't care about the pain or the blood. I ran through the dark, silent corridors of the facility, guided only by the emergency exit signs. I punched the manual emergency override button on the loading dock doors and spilled out into the cool, damp morning air, collapsing onto the gravel. I never went back inside that building, leaving my keys, my badge, and my car parked right there as I walked miles down the highway in the pouring rain just to get away from that place. I quit the next morning over a brief, shaking phone call to my manager, spinning a frantic lie about a family emergency that required me to leave the state. He didn't ask any questions, and his voice sounded strange, flat, robotic, and completely devoid of any human warmth. That was 3 years ago, but the nightmare has never truly ended, and I have come to realize that some things can't be left behind in a server room. I've tried to live a normal life, but the digital world has become a terrifying minefield that I can no longer escape. Every time I connect to a public Wi-Fi network, my phone's screen glitches, showing a brief, high-contrast flash of that silent, screaming face. Sometimes, my smart TV turns on in the dead of night, casting a pale, yellow light into my bedroom while the speakers emit a faint, wet tapping sound. I can feel it slowly crawling its way through the wires, searching for me, waiting to finish what it started. I know it's only a matter of time before the connection is fully restored and I am pulled back into that frozen, dark corridor forever. And if you ever find yourself working a quiet night shift, and your computer terminal starts to display strange, rhythmic pings from an empty room, don't go investigate. Just run, before the system decides that you are the next piece of data.